Okay. So this is an introduction to Pyramid for people that know enough about Python to read it and enough about the web to understand what the heck I'm talking about. If you don't know computers at all, the couches are very comfy, and you should really take advantage of that. As a bit of a background, my name is Tod Hansmann. I don't really identify as anything particularly interesting. I am a technologist and a dev, and I rant online sometimes, and that's about it. If you want to find me online to ask me questions or yell at me or whatever, it's usually Tod Punk. Note there's one D in Tod. I'm that everywhere. I'm the only Tod Punk in the world. I don't know why. I think Tod's a great name, but that's me. I work at a company called MobileSense right now. They're over in Alpine. They are also not looking, but you know, maybe they'll fire me and need you. So Pyramid, we work in Pyramid at MobileSense right now. I've run across it before when it was called Pylons, and we'll get to that in a sec. But it doesn't get enough love. Everybody's really, really popular with the Django for the big sites, and for like the pet projects, it's Flask or Bottle or Cherry or whatever. And Pyramid is kind of this like in between the two that nobody really understands, and the documentation's kind of weird, and you talk to the people and they all love it, but they can't explain what the heck it is. So I'm here to kind of translate for those people. I don't know if anybody is very familiar with the Python web landscape. Way back when Python was not the popular language it is today, the only web stuff that we had was something called Zope, and that quickly got rewritten to Zope 2 because it was a bad idea, and it was written into a different but still bad idea. For some reason, I view Zope 2 as essentially somebody thought Java EE was a good idea to bring to Python, and that was a terrible idea, and people kind of built onto it with other terrible ideas, and nobody could make sense of it all. So you would write Zope applications, and there would be this monstrous things that would be doing all these other black boxes tied into bigger black boxes that you just didn't understand unless you dived into the code and read archaic runes, and it was bad. So a whole bunch of people said, you know what, we need to rewrite this. And so Zope 3, also called Blue Dream, or one of its many sisters, was written, and nobody went there. Nobody. Now I say nobody, and obviously there were people that went there and wrote it and were very happy, and we don't talk to those people because they went off into their own little land and ignored everybody. Zope 3 was essentially a more modularized version of the same Zope 2, and a bunch of the other people that were core Zope 2 people went off and rewrote their own thing, and they called it repos.bfg, and they were writing their thing separately. Some other dudes were writing this thing called Pylons, and the repos people and the Pylons people kind of got together like on the internet like people do, and they said, man, we're really writing kind of the same code here. So they decided, okay, so we'll just combine our efforts because we both are thinking the same thing, and we'll just call it something else. So they took the repos stuff, they took the Pylon stuff that was an API and converted it into repos and became Pyramid. Pyramid is Pyramid's the project, like Apache's the project, but everybody calls Apache Apache, even though Apache is the foundation and HTTP is the server. And it's weird. Pyramid's like that. If you're using Pyramid, you're using the web framework of the Pyramid project. Nobody actually cares, so when you use that in conversation, they will follow you. And the basic idea behind Pyramid was they want to give you all the things that you would want to build a website, a web application, but they don't want you to have to use it. So, and we'll kind of compare this a little bit more in the future, but Flask is like a single file kind of, here's the basics to wire HTTP to Python. And a few routing tools and other things that you will need to convert a web request to Python code. And Django is like, man, we want to give you everything under the sun. We'll give you an ORM and a templating language and an authentication system and middleware, and we will give you everything. And that's cool. I mean, I'm not going to diss it or anything. I've used all of these, and I don't like Django because I don't like everything in the kitchen sink. That's not how I work as a programmer, or I'd probably be working in some other technology than I am. Your mileage may vary, and I'll hate you privately for it, and that's fine. The pyramid way is to give you all those things, but only have you include them as you need, and give you this request path to tie into. So if you don't want to use their authentication system, and you shouldn't, you don't have to. They don't have an ORM. They use SQL Alchemy or any other thing that you want to tie into your data backend, and I'll show you stuff with SQL Alchemy later. But you don't have to use it either. You can tie into Mongo or whatever under the sun you want. If you don't want any of their stuff and you just want the translator, I don't know why you're using Pyramid, but you can use a very, very small subset, and we do. So why Pyramid at all? I have this wonderful little link on the bottom here. Go. And a lot of you may have seen this. This is snake food graphs drawn. This is an article that came out a while ago, and it runs snake food on popular Python projects, including web frameworks, and kind of sees what kind of complexity is in there. So this is Bottle, and you can see it's very, very lacking in a lot of depth and complexity there. Bottle's good for tinking around with. I've played with it. It's actually quite nice. But you can see there's not a whole lot going on there. A lot of things don't reference a whole lot of other things. It's not tightly coupled to a whole lot of itself. So either it's not giving you a lot of functionality or it's very well organized. I happen to think it's somewhere in the middle there. It's specifically not trying to. This is Django. As you can see, everything is tied to everything. Even if you don't use the ORM, you're still loading it. This is Flask. Again, it's giving you a lot more stuff in there somewhere. I don't know what it's doing necessarily. These graphs are not supposed to be 100% displays of them. But it kind of gives you an idea. Actually, a lot of stuff in there that's going to get loaded when you want to use this thing. It doesn't tie to every other thing under the sun. And then this is Pyramid. You can see that there's a lot more complexity there, but it's not anywhere near the rat's nest that Django is, and I personally interpret that as a good thing. You may find it not. These are other completely unrelated. This is Twisted. Please avoid Twisted if you can. It's it's become a bit of a beast. Mercurial. I don't know why, but it is.
They didn't do Git, though?
They did not do, well, Git isn't like Python.
That's true. They're not.
I don't.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Sorry.
So,
I was comparing the two, and I was thinking, oh, that's good.
So, I mean, the link's in the slides, so you'll have it on YouTube there or whatever, and can look at those and read the article. It does give a good, very, very non-biased explanation of things. But that's where we are at as of a year ago when this was written. That's the complexity of the projects that we're talking about. So Pyramid is about compromise. It's about saying, you know, we don't need everything, but you might want all of these things, and I might want all of these things instead. So why not just put them in like little couches that we can bring together and make a big living room? Modules are big these days, plugins or apps, middleware, whatever your favorite framework calls them, they're all the same thing. And it kind of gives you the flexibility to go from like your little toy project that I've got on the side. Like I have a site that I just fiddle with, and that's actually what I'll be showing you. I'm constantly breaking it. It's not in any state that it's usable by anyone but me, and it's not even usable by me most of the time because I'm breaking it. But if you wanted to do something bigger, if you wanted to grow, you're not going to have an easy time of that with something like Bottle. It just doesn't give you all the glue that you need to make something, I'm going to say, serious. So, is it possible? Sure. Is it really going to be an uphill battle? Yes. Yes, it is. Also, you may hate yourself and want to bring yourself pain. So, Pyramid can do that for you if you'd like. We'll get into the security model a little bit, and you can go down that path if you want. I will not show you that path, because I will not go down that path. There be dragons there. But you can if you want. Who's to stop you? And then this one's, my favorite is that this is really thought out with the other things in mind that you would never want in your web framework, but you might want to tie into your web framework. Things like they do not have a REST API thing for you. Somebody else has written one. So there are actually several. I use Cornice at work for our REST APIs. It kind of breaks out requests, and it's nice. But it's not written by the core Pyramid people. They just put in the glue so that somebody else could write one and tie it in. So it's just architected with what you want to do in mind to extend what you want to do with Pyramid. And of course, you know, it's Python. That's good. There are some things that you will let you write in Python, but they're not Python in the core. So this is nice as a nice compromise. You're not using mod Python written in C to tie your Python to Apache. You're using just Python. Just Python. But that comes with some headaches and problems. The way that people use the web in Python these days is typically WSGI. It's not required, but it is recommended by Django, Pyramid, Flask, everybody, because that's the standard. It's defined in PEP 333, and PEP 3333 extended it. So let's take a step back and not talk in Python land. This is just raw HTTP. This is an actual request that you could make if you were to go to Telnet and tie to a web server on port 80 and just type that out. I don't know why you would type that out, but whatever. You can see that it's really just kind of a whole bunch of key pairs and just text. That's HTTP. It's streaming text in plain sight over a web socket. What people have often done to translate HTTP into a language is usually tie it to a key value pair, like a dictionary or a map or whatever your language calls it. PHP has, in the past, had several global variable things that it will tie. So you'll notice the HTTP referrer here. They actually have referrer spelled correctly there. In Pyramid, they give you both spellings because people spell it wrong. They both tie to the same thing, but you can use either. You can be wrong and still be right. I don't know why this is the case. I mean, we all know Python, the dot refer is still accessing a dictionary. It's still accessing an attribute of an object that it's through a dictionary kind of relationship.
It's HTTP spelling.
Yes, among other places. But this is not necessarily the best way to approach HTTP, and we learned this way back when CGI was a thing, and then we made fast CGI and all of its cousins and etc. So if you want to look at the WSGI spec, like, you can learn why they made some of the decisions that they made, but some of those decisions are really nice and some of those decisions are really bad, and they just kind of sit somewhere between CGI and fast CGI in their relationship. And for reference, CGI came out in 1993, and fast CGI came out late 90s, early 2000s as a spec. So WSGI came out in 2006, 2008, somewhere in there? I can't remember. And as a spec, it basically learned nothing from fast CGI. So let's go back to Pyramid Land. Let's go talk Python stuff. This is a config file, and it's basically a sectioned INI file, key value pairs. So to get started with Pyramid, you just install it into your virtual env or your site packages or whatever with pip or whatever. Yeah, exactly. And so you just use pcreate, which is a Pyramid project creator, and with a -s is your scaffold, and we'll get into what that means in a moment, and name the app. This is a lot like Django or Flask. They both give you kind of application starter tools. And this one will create kind of a demo app for you right in the directory you're in, called whatever you named it. So right here we have the scaffold called Alchemy. That's to start with a scaffolding for all the configuration bits that you need for SQL Alchemy. I don't know why they didn't call it SQL Alchemy, because that's what it is. Save you 3 characters. I don't know. But that's what it is. It just gives you a setup for an SQL Alchemy string and all the configuration details for it, and gives you a models directory. Yay. I don't really consider that helpful, because it's just this. The single line is all it gives you. And you can see I have an example of the actual SQL Alchemy URL I use. I use Postgres. You're welcome. And you should too. But if you just want to use an SQLite thing, it's right there as well. You don't need credentials or anything like that. And then it goes into the WSGI stuff. The WSGI stuff is used. This is not the WSGI app. This is the WSGI config details that is imported into the app that we'll get to later. Like I said in the slide before, this is very simple. How it gets used is a little harder. You'll notice it defines the host right here. This is the development.ini. You will have a production INI that is separate from this, and you tell Pyramid which one to use at runtime. I don't think that you would want to use Waitress necessarily in production. That's something for you to decide when you actually get to production, or something for your DevOps team, or whatever they are called today. I don't have a preference. And there's a lot more in here than that, mostly around logging stuff. But that's the config file. It's just an INI file. It's really easy. So, with that in mind, let's actually tie some HTTP to some Python. So this is the easy bit. Every technology web stuff has this concept where you have a URL, mydomain.com/path/to/thing, and that maps to some code, right? PHP, that runs a PHP file. And it may be obvious in the URL, like this is my file.php. It may be mapped. It may be in a rewrite rule for Apache. I don't know. But there is going to be a file that is run, right? If you don't know that, that's fine. Bless your soul. Please never learn PHP. Java, depending on what you're doing with Java, there's a lot of different ways. But in Java EE, you're installing some class that is your main thing, and your Glassfish server, or your Tomcat, or your JBoss is calling that class's API entry point, and it runs a whole bunch of crap, etc. And it gets messy, and it just really depends on your application. I don't know why you would want to do that. Apparently enterprise. Python just runs a function. It can be a function on a class, like a method of a member of a class or an instance of a class or whatever. How that gets tied to is completely irrelevant because WSGI doesn't specify it at all. You, as the framework writer, would tie that together. In Pyramid land, it's definitely a function. In Django land, it's a function that's routed through a router depending on the app that it's called, and the view. It's a little more complicated in there. You'll see it's very, very simple in Pyramid. Kind of like Flask, you just use a decorator to run. This URL goes to this function, bar none. Every time you call this URL, it goes to this function. So it's very easy to follow. Yeah, so this is literally the entirety of your config. Well, it's your init.py typically. It doesn't have to be. You could be whatever. But in your init ini or init.py, you will have this line importing your view. That's just a function. Don't let that scare you. That is just a function. The view is a function. My view is a function. And you'll have two calls in this method. One, you take your config, and we'll go over what that is in a minute, and you add a route. And you give it a name, and you give it the actual route. So this is the prefix. It cuts off the domain completely. It doesn't care about domains. You do not get to know what your domain is unless you dig for it. It's not handed to you automatically because who cares about domains? They're not important. That's Apache's job or something. So it goes prefix and then puts these two things, whatever they are. It can be a regex, but it's usually just whatever variables between slashes I want you to assign to a variable called 1. So is everybody following that? Is anybody confused with how that happens? The slashes, everything in there, in a string, goes into 1. And then this one goes into 2. And if you have more slashes, this route does not apply. So if you have a trailing slash here, you don't have that route. That's a different route. So you can assign multiple routes, but you don't get the added slash like you do in Django. Django has the config option to just take trailing slashes and be fine with it. Pyramid's a little less flexible in that regard. And then you add a view for that route. So you take this, you add the view function, and then you say what route name are we applying to that function? And you can do multiple routes to the same view. It doesn't care. But you have to assign a route to a view for it to do anything. Because otherwise it will say, okay, I recognize this route, you've come in, now what do I do with it? I have no clue. So, yeah, that's the basics of routing in that form, in the config edition form of Pyramid. There is another way, a way more familiar to the Flask people. And this is, you add a route, and then you just add a view config decorator to your view. So this is, you can read the comments. I mean, in some other file, the scan will find all the views that have the view config decorator applied to them. And it will apply the route, or routes, that need to go onto it. So that kind of separates route and view config into their own respective places. I don't know if that's good or bad. That's up to you to decide. It's just flexible like that. And that's a good thing. It allows you to organize your code how you want. So you'll notice that we have a request coming into this view. We'll get into that a little more in a bit. And we return a response. Shocking. It's almost like HTTP, where you request something and you get a response. And, you know, if you don't know decorators, and a lot of people don't, and that's fine, you know, you should learn them at some point. They're a little fancy and a little hard to follow, but there are some good tutorials out there. They're very powerful. They will add a lot to your Python lexicon. This is our regex nonsense. So there's a caveat here, and we'll get to that in a moment. This is the same thing that we were doing with our route before. But instead, we've added a regex saying this has to be a digit. If something comes in and it doesn't match that regex, it will move on as if it didn't find the route. So if that is not a digit, if I say like slash something slash Jehoshaphat, it will not match that route because that route will only match digits, one or more digits specifically. If you don't know regex, that's fine. Another tool you should learn. Write that down. Go read about it later. I don't think you can actually get through the routing in any powerful sort of way without these regexes, but you have to understand that it will not translate that to an integer. So in our request, we are using this wonderful little dictionary that it provides for us with all the matches that it is found in the URL, and we are accessing object ID with matchdict object ID. And we're parsing that through an int. So I don't put this in a try block because it will always be an integer. Every single time. It is guaranteed to only contain digits, and it is guaranteed to parse into an integer. Unless it's some ungodly long digit, which at some point somebody's going to do that and they're breaking my website, and I don't care if they get an error. I just don't care. So this will take that, parse it into a myint, and then parse that into a string right after that, which is kind of comical and ironic. I could just assign it and just use it as a string, but I'm not going to because I am me. And all of this is because HTTP does not deal in data types at all. HTTP passes strings. If you want to complain about that, go talk to the Unicode people, and they will feel your pain. So that was very simple. We're just routing a request. That's not anything fancy. Let's do some more. This is where we experience the pain of Pyramid. And I don't think it's unique to Pyramid. I think it's unique to web dev in general. I am a web dev professionally by day. It's my day job. But I hate web dev. It's not a fun life, I'll tell you. So this is where we are taking the core functionality of Pyramid and adding what we want. It's not the Pyramid way. It's my way. So the joy of this is Pyramid did not plan for me to be able to do the specific thing that I'm doing. It just planned a way for me to be able to tie new functionality into what I'm doing. And for those that don't know from the code what I'm doing, I will tell you. Here we have the main for our WSGI app. And you can tell because at the bottom here we're returning a make WSGI app, which I don't know what that is. Well, I know what that is. But you're not supposed to know what a WSGI app is because this is Python land and that's taken care of for you, okay? This is Pyramid and they have provided you a way to do that with the WSGI process. Whatever WSGI server you're asking for, it goes and does that for you. That's cool, awesome. So let's ignore the fact that this is a WSGI app and focus on the fact that this is the entry point for running this entire program. Main, it doesn't have to be called main. You may remember that in the config file, we actually called what function this whole package would start with. And we started with main. The scaffolding set this all up. I didn't write this at all. It kind of gave me the engine, because I'm using an SQL Alchemy scaffold. It gave me the settings saying, hey, this is the transaction extension. And that means, for anybody that doesn't know anything about database work, a transaction is, I want to start working with the database here, and somewhere along the way, something goes wrong, or everything goes right. At the end, I get to decide whether that transaction should actually apply to the database or whether we throw it all out. So this, the Zope transaction extension, is a holdover from Zope. That was actually a good idea. Every request comes in, it starts a new transaction. You don't have to manage it. You can if you want, but you don't have to. And that transaction starts, you do stuff with the database. If there's an exception that you weren't planning on, if there's an exception that you did get and you want to throw another exception, anytime that the response is not a 200 level, it will roll back that whole extension. You don't have to manage that at all. So if there's ever a problem, you don't have to worry what is happening to my database. It just chucks it out. And that's nice for what I do. It might not be nice for what you do. I don't know. You decide. It has this SessionFactory thing that if you don't know anything about HTTP sessions, that is meaningless and mysterious to you, and if you do, then that looks kind of scary to you, and that's fine, because it is. That's how they choose to manage sessions. You can write your own. It doesn't matter. And then we have the config. That config has been passed around a lot. I told you we would talk about it. Here we are. Config is a configurator object where we're passing in the settings from that settings file. The settings file is passed in right here as a dictionary. So it just translates that whole INI file to a dictionary that it's using in that configurator. So all of those settings get thrown into Python land. And if you want to modify them, that's where you do so. And we will. It takes that SessionFactory, applies that. That's great. I am including two things here that are important to anyone that wants to work with Jinja 2 or REST APIs through Cornice. I am including modules that have absolutely nothing to do with the core Pyramid project. This one is named Pyramid Jinja 2, but it's written by some other dude. It is not a Pyramid official project. I think it's documented at the Pyramid website through Sphinx stuff, but that's not important. I decided I wanted to do Jinja 2 because I'm not fiddling with that chameleon crap. That chameleon crap is left over from Zope, and I hate it. I don't want to do it. If you love it, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. You need to convert. So I'm going to use Jinja 2 templates by including that module. This is right at the beginning. This is only loaded once for this thread. I'm going to include Cornice because I want to do some REST stuff. I want to provide an API that the JavaScript hipsters can totally use for whatever they want. I'm a JavaScript hipster. Get over yourself. So, and then we add a static view for all of our static files because I don't want to serve JPEG by reading in the bytes and throwing it out with a content type of JPEG. We will let it handle that for us. Normally, you don't do this for anything other than dev. I keep that in my config regardless, because if somehow they get past Apache, I want it to continue working. But I will usually have Apache or Nginx take, through some rewrite rule or whatever, take the static directory and serve it itself, because it's going to be way faster for that. But in dev, I don't want to set up Nginx or Apache because they're bloated and I don't need them. So that is where I'm adding a static view for all the static files. As long as I have it in the /static directory, there it is. You can name it whatever you want. I don't care. And neither does Pyramid. Then I call a thing called add routes and add views where I have all of my other routes and views in a nice organized list. And that's not here. I'm not going to show it to you because it's long. I have a lot of routes. It's a complicated app. And then here's where we actually add our new functionality of a database. We take our config and we add a request method. And you'll notice that in the view we had that request object, the thing that gave us the nice .matchDict. Remember? You know? Yeah. So I want to add my own thing. I want to call my database session .db. So here I'm providing a function called db that will get added to that request object on every single request. And it happens for free because I just get it every time that a request is given. So I'm just creating a new session and applying it to this name through the reify value. It doesn't have to be reified, but this way, and every time I access it, it's only called the first time. I don't know if everybody knows that, especially beginners to Python. Reify is awesome, and you should look into it. It's great. It really is. And then we add another one called user, because I want access to what the user is logged in, because I'm not using Pyramid's ridiculous authentication system. And then we add a new renderer, because I don't know if you know this. If you have never worked with JSON, then well, you're going to at some point if you're going to stick with this web dev thing. I'm sorry. You're just going to. JSON doesn't have types for things like date times. So when we were trying to JSONify all of our database stuff, it would come back in date time format, and that's great for everything in Python land, but when you try to translate that to JSON, it's like, well, what format would you like that in? Because it only does strings and numbers. There is no date time format or anything like that. So we add a datetime renderer. It's called addAdapter for this particular JSON renderer. We use, I think, UJSON in production? I'm not sure. What? There is no XML discussion in this presentation. We hate XML. No. No, there are XML renderers that are written because, again, people write this stuff for Pyramid all the time. It doesn't come by default, but they do have them. And then this just, every time there's a date time, it does the date serializer, and it moves on. That's how I've completely modified how Pyramid behaves for the things that I need, and it never actually cared. It provided those functionality. It doesn't know what I'm doing. It doesn't know when I'm doing it. It just does it when it needs to because I told it to. And I really like Pyramid for doing that. I really like Pyramid for obeying me, rather than me obeying Django. Flask doesn't even provide this. Flask is just like, well, you can extend it. We just haven't provided any of that glue. And that's fine, because for a lot of things that I'm going to do with Flask, I don't need that. And then the config scan, picks up all the view stuff. So let's talk about templating, because again, I absolutely love Jinja 2, and you should too. Pyramid Jinja 2 is the module that provides Jinja. There's a couple others, I guess. I don't know why you'd use them, but they exist. And there's two ways to include them. You saw one where I did the config include, and the other one is in your INI, you can just include all these modules. This is from my development.ini. So we have this debug toolbar, and you'll notice that the first time you run an app, it has this little floaty thing on the side that has a logo you've never seen before, because they don't use it anywhere on their actual website. I don't know why. But that's their debug toolbar to access the back end. I don't really use that very often. It's rare that I have to, because I use PyCharm and it kind of provides a debugger for me. I don't know if anybody calls me blasphemous for that, but whatever. Transaction Manager, not trademark, Transaction Manager. Don't worry. It's all open source. It's all very good. Jinja 2, and then this is the exception log. By default, you won't log exceptions because that's not a very important thing. You shouldn't have exceptions that you are not catching in their mind. So they've provided this thing for the people like me who are incredibly lazy and want to catch the things that we don't catch in a log file to review later. That extends some things in the config file, and I'll let you read the documentation later. I don't want to go into it. It adds a whole bunch of crap. And so those are the two ways that you can add Jinja 2 to it. This is Chameleon. I'm just doing the same thing, essentially, in Chameleon versus Jinja 2. I'm showing you why I hate Chameleon. So if you have noticed, this looks a lot like combining HTML and some tags and stuff, and I don't know about anybody here, but I use Angular at work, and they do this too. I kind of hate it, but it is what it is. Yeah. So mixing your logic into HTML style things is not my style of templating. And the documentation on this is all stuck in 2004. Because if you read Chameleon stuff, you're actually reading ZPT or ZOP page translation, whatever they are. It's the old ZOP templating language that the Pyramid people just didn't want to relearn a new language, even though this took me like 4 hours to figure out how to do. Because how do you loop over a list in Chameleon? That's not anywhere in the world of the internet. And if you want to do that in Jinja 2, it's like, oh yeah, just in the documentation, it's right here. It took me half an hour. So this is the same thing in Jinja 2. You can notice that there's a clear separation between templating logic and the actual HTML. You have a for each in a very Pythonic way. It's not actually Python. Don't let that catch you. It is not Python. But it behaves a lot like Python. And you can just iterate over things, and that's awesome. You want to stick a variable in there? Done. Is that an int? Is that a string? I don't know. I don't care. Just throw it in there. It's going to end up in a string anyway, because this is HTTP and the world hates us. So I hope that's pretty clear that you don't really want to use Chameleon unless you just really love that style. But I leave it for you to decide, and I will hate you personally later. SQL Alchemy. This is going to be not important at all for some people that are not. They're into whatever NoSQL thing is hip these days. But I'm going to go over it because I'm a professional and I'm an adult and I can do what I want. So we talked about the ZOP transaction extension. SQL Alchemy also provides connection pooling. So you have a single thread for your WSGI process, right? But it will handle multiple requests at once. So while this request comes in and it's talking to the database, it can handle another request and wait for another thing to the database. But if you handle like 50 requests, that's going to put a strain on your database depending on what your database is. Like if it's MySQL, it won't actually scale to that. But if you want, you can control how many connections go to the database, and it will just block on new connections until those are open, which may not be a great user experience, but it may be the saving grace that makes your DBA not hate you. And then there are exceptions in database land, and they are painful to deal with, and you kind of need to be aware of them, regardless of what database you're using. And they will bubble up, and just be aware that SQL Alchemy will throw things at you. It will throw things at you all day long, so just be careful with SQL Alchemy and learn some SQL. Now, how do you throw this on the web? Luckily, I have this wonderful drawing app called Paint.net because I'm on Windows, and that's actually why I'm on Windows, because this is actually a tablet, and I can just draw right on it, which is nice. Oh, you want to update? Don't. No. No, I don't want to install it all. No, go away. I'm an adult. So if we just kind of expand our canvas to be twice the size, I don't actually want to save any of this, so, you know, whatever. Did you just crash on me? No, you did not. Okay. So let's talk about hosting. The reason that this has to be drawn is because there's going to be a lot of things because Python doesn't actually have multi-threading. I don't know if you know this. Anybody that tells you that there's actual multi-threading in Python is a complete liar, or he doesn't understand threading. There is only a single thread in your Python instance, your Python process, and it kind of fakes it by task switching, but it's not actually a different thread. It's not running on a different core. You're sharing time, you're sharing resources, and you, more importantly, are sharing process space, which changes some things like environment variables, which are very important if you're running under things like Apache or Nginx. So be aware of those things, and let's get started talking about hosting on an Apache or an Nginx or an app thing out in, I don't know, DigitalOcean or whatever, Amazon, whatever three-letter acronym they have for this. And so we'll pretend that we have this web out here, right? I am a great drawer. That's why I have a tablet. I am an artist. Nobody say differently. It will hurt my feelings. So this is the internet. So the internet wants your stuff. So you have this wonderful little server that's connected to the internet. And we'll give them a little happy face. And so your server is really happy because it's only waiting for requests. Well, a request comes in, and in its conceptual space, it has Apache. Come on. So it has Apache or whatever your favorite web server is. Just replace that. You know, I love you too. It's okay. And Apache is actually running a WSGI process that will start your Python process. So WSGI, and then that leads to Python.
Across his teeth.
Yeah, it's very. Oh, that's unfortunate because I like my drink.
Simmer down up there.
Getting too wild. So. If you have 8 cores on your server, 7 of them will be wasted with this. I'm not sure whether that's ideal or not. Maybe you have 10 other things running on this web server and you only want one process. That's up to you, but it's in the Apache config. Apache controls this. Your Python app has no idea whether it's being run in one process or 18 million. And it doesn't care, because it only handles what it knows about, which is, I was run, I must handle requests handed to me. So if you want to take advantage, you have to spin up another WSGI, which does another Python. Now, one of the bad things about WSGI, it was actually designed so that you could run multiple WSGI processes, well, multiple WSGI apps on the same WSGI process. That doesn't work because we wrote frameworks on top of WSGI that broke that because it was a dumb idea in the first place. So when you want to run a Django app and a Python app and a Flask app and whatever other apps you want to run, you run them in different WSGI processes and they're going to share resources and not be aware of each other either. So it's just important to realize that this is Python, not your app, right? So the Python space is going to share things like all of your environment variables that were set up when you ran Apache or you started a shell or whatever you're running this under. And WSGI specifies a WSGI environment that is started from whatever the WSGI server is, in this case Apache. That doesn't change, but it can change between processes. So you have to make sure that those are always the same. That's why we have the INI file, to guarantee that those are the same. And Apache kind of does a lot, well, and Nginx both do some very specific things to make sure that that WSGI process stays the same consistent across multiple runs, because it will bring them down and bring them back up as you request. So when a request comes in, it comes in and Apache's like, oh my gosh, Apache, I have a request. It's going to this URL. I know that needs to be a WSGI process. And it goes to this one, right? So if anybody is not familiar with web apps, that request comes back and goes to the user. And everything is dead now. Everything you just did is as if it never happened. It is not aware, in HTTP land, it is not aware of anything you did. And when the user comes back, supposedly they've logged in, but HTTP doesn't actually have any logic around this. So we store a thing called a session in the user's browser somehow. I don't know how. It's up to you. There's a number of ways. It's outside the scope of this. Just pretend there's magic session in the browser, and then it goes back to Apache and says, hey, I'm logged in now. Give me this thing instead. And Apache is somehow supposed to know that it was like a logged-in user. And Apache doesn't actually know, because Apache's not the thing handling our authentication. Python is. So what happens in the second request if, oh, Apache knows there's a request, oh, I'm going to go to this Python request. If you're storing that in memory, that session data, so that you can know whether this user is actually logged in, that Python request has no idea, none. This is kind of unique because in other languages, like in like a Java EE app, don't ask me how I know this. I prefer not to talk about that dark time. You are sharing different process space in memory mapping through whatever mechanism in your either your application server or your Hibernate or whatever. There's multiple ways that you can actually share data between processes. Python doesn't have those. Python has to write somewhere else, like the database or a file or something, to share data between interprocesses, unless you want to have a headache. There are interprocess communication for Python. Don't do it, especially not in a web app. Bad. But, so the other Python process doesn't know about it. So Apache will actually take the session data and be able to route it to the same request, but you have to have some way of persisting it. So it'll come in, and it'll go to this Python process, and now how do you know whether it's a logged-in user or not? Well, hopefully you have cookies or authentication or something in there. But the point is that your WSGI process is it's its own island. And how does that work? Or how does that work to our advantage? Well, so for large-scale web apps, you have usually something on the front end, hopefully, or on the back end that makes this either redundant. So like all of these WSGI processes store in the same database. That's a Coke can, or Pepsi can if you're a fan. I don't know. So the Python process talks to the database, and the database stores the login information or the session information so that it doesn't matter which request it goes to. That's up to you. I'm not going to say which one's better or worse because it depends on what your application is or where it's hosted. If you have 7 different servers around the world, well, talking to the same database is going to be hard. So some people do that on the front end. Some people say, I have multiple Apache servers, and I'm going to have a load balancer on the front, kill that, come here, and it will know which session I need to go to. So it will go first time this one, the second WSGI process on that server. And it will stay there as long as that session's active. This is important in WSGI land just because of that separation of process space. You don't share information. You can share information between requests in the same process space, but you just have to be aware of that because it doesn't exist in like PHP land where every request builds up an entire runtime environment and then closes it all, because you're already not worrying about inter-process communication. The advantage to Python as a web application server is you can store things in memory and have them persist across requests, even between different users. So if you want, you can have some sort of incrementer in memory, not in a database, not in some file, that you can tell, hey, I'm on this process. It will name itself or something with some GUID or whatever, and this is how many times I've been hit by everybody. So I request in my web browser, and it goes to there, and it gives me this thread, or this process, I should say, sorry, process. It gives me this process, and I'm the first visitor. Then Clint goes, and he's the second visitor on that process, but the second process has had no visitors. So then Lorna goes, and she hits the second process because the round robining is hidden, or whatever, and she's the first visitor. And I can share information with Clint on my thread, or on my process. I can't share information with Lorna on her process, and that's very different than PHP, where there are no processes. There's only the request. In Java land, they are all on the same application server. And the load balancer might be on front, but they are all on the same process space sort of memory mapping thing. So you're running on 4 cores. Each thread you throw out is from your Java applet rather than, say, like the WSGI process. Apache is the one running your process. And that was way, way, way in depth in more systems engineering side of things than most app developers will ever want to know. But I think it's important, and I think you should know. And if you don't know, and if you don't think that's important, you probably shouldn't be a web dev. But you will, because we're all web devs. We can't escape it. And that's why I'm a web dev. So I don't want to save that. So let's actually run this thing, and I'll show you some code on an actual application. So this is a Surface 1, and I don't know if anybody else has played with one. I have mine because I use Windows in a game. Oh no. Come back to us. Yeah, I know. Because I like to game and I like Windows and I like to develop, so I have, you know, my Linux VM to do all of my serious development in on the command line. But you know, I use PyCharm, so it's not a thing with Python. With C it is, but we'll pretend I don't program in C. So this is, it's called a website. It's my little repo for playing with web stuff that I don't care about. You can see there's a whole bunch of crap in here. If I show you the static, I have an Angular app. It's not running an Angular app right now. This is incredibly broken. I used it to learn some stuff with Angular, and I decided I hated it, and I will never do it in my personal job. So we use it at work, and that's fine. I'll stick to like vanilla JS or something. But in here you have our init.py. And some of this code will look familiar to anybody that was paying attention to the slide. For those that were asleep, that's fine. The couches are comfy. The DB and user are adding to the request. Here's my date serializer for serializing my JSON stuff. It's very, very simple. And yeah, all of it in one little file. That's my entire application. You can see our...
Can you change the colors?
What?
Can you change the colors?
Can I change the colors? I think I can.
It's hard to read it. Size works too.
View. I've never had to do this before.
Presentation mode.
Is there a presentation mode?
Yeah, go view. It's the bottom of the menu.
Ooh. Wow. Congratulations. That was awesome.
There's clapping.
Well, it was more of like a seizure spread across the audience. I'm not. So this is our ini, or our init.py. And this is our main. It's at the end because I want to use stuff above it. And it's a lot like what I showed you guys in the slides. I have another one called get site config, which is an experiment that I won't go into. But you'll also notice that I'm not using Jinja here because I'm a liar. And I just haven't really converted to that. So these are this is just like a simple blog experiment. It's not all working, but we will actually run it. So you can see I've kind of organized into what blog it is. I'm trying to provide a RESTful interface to it, even though that's not actually functioning at all right now. And I wanted some sort of other menu items. So like I can take a post and take it out of the listing of posts and just use that as a page. So I'm really kind of half-assing a CMS with my blog that isn't working. So you can see how successful I am in my programming career with this wonderful experimenting. So this is my super secret cookie hash, just in case anybody wants to hack my non-existent site. And I use this as just kind of some settings, like for when I have 50 pages in my blog post, because I'm really auspicious and ambitious. I want it to be able to say like the page counter on the bottom will have 2 things on each side at max, not like 17. And I only want to put 5 posts per page or whatever. I can change those in a single dictionary. I like data-driven performance. It's my thing. I'm not saying it's the best way, but you should do it anyway. I don't think... How do I switch files in this one? Nope, nope, nope. No, it's... Oh. No. No. I don't think... Well, I guess I can. Can I just... If I close this, it's going to kill it. Enter full screen, view, exit presentation mode, and oh wow, it just killed everything. Okay, fine. I didn't. Yeah. Thank you, PyCharm. IntelliJ's products, guys. If you haven't looked at IntelliJ's products, like if you're stuck on Eclipse or something, just throw that out the window and go look at IntelliJ. It's really nice. It's worth the $100 or whatever. What? Android's kind of its own special, terrible hell.
Yes.
So let's go into a view. These are my basic views, and we'll go back into presentation mode. I wish there was a shortcut for that. I imagine it doesn't get a whole lot of use. This is a simple view. This is the home route. And you can see here I am actually using Jinja. It doesn't work because I haven't included it. But I just return a dictionary to that template engine, and it just does everything for me. So it'll name something called content, and then I can use a variable called content in the templating engine, and it will just put the content wherever it is, because I'm lazy. This is the menu thing where I wanted to take a post and tie it to things. So like this is the blog, menu/blog will take you to the blog, the first blog, supposedly, when it has data, and do things with it. So it's just a redirect. And for some reason, I don't know why they didn't do like redirect, because that would have made more sense to me. They did an HTTP found, which HTTP found is not an actual like code. The HTTP spec says redirect or temporarily moved. It doesn't say found. If you found something, give it to me. If it doesn't exist, we just say that doesn't exist. I'm sorry. I should put like a not really on here, but so that's the basic views. They're very simple. The more complicated views, come on, thank you. The more complicated views, like the blog views, this is where we have view presentation mode. This is where we have multiple routes tied to a single place, right? And it doesn't matter how many view configs you add, it'll be fine because it's just wrapping the function that it wrapped before, and it will just skip over itself. All of these work, except they're Ninja 2. And it's just a really simple grab things from what ID that you're looking for, and then put them in a dictionary and spit it back to the templating engine. It's really simple web dev here. I'm not doing anything fancy. We have in the past, at MobileSense, we do some fancy things to control access and do manipulations, but you know, this is all really simple stuff. It's just Python. You can do whatever you want in here. You don't have to access the database. As long as you're throwing stuff to the templating engine that it can read, whatever. So the last bit I will show you is workflow problems that may be helpful if you want to actually do this after I have rambled. So, come on. In here, I have a thing called initializeDB. This is actually set up by the scaffolding. You'll get it every single time if you do the pcreate. You don't have to use the pcreate. Once you know what you're doing, you don't actually use the pcreate. I don't, because I'm lazy. And I don't want all this bloat. But this is my initialization script. And in PyCharm, I can run it with this little Python runny thing that I have set up. I'm not stuck to the IDE. I just use it because I don't like typing all of that stuff every time I want to run it. So the initializeDB, if I go into presentation mode, you can see I have all these wonderful imports. And these are a couple functions that I have set up for logging and things that if I run this initialize database script, it will, and it fails for some reason, it will tell me. You can see my models. These are SQL Alchemy models. Again, it's a little outside the scope, but they're just objects that you can assume relate to data on the back end somewhere. And I have a password hashing utility that I wrote because I'm lazy. And this is our usage args, because this is a command line script. I don't know if I've made that clear. It's totally run from the command line. I've just tied it to a button because, again, I'm lazy. And this is meant to take the database and throw it out and rebuild it. So it drops everything from the database and then recreates it and then throws in a default user. It throws in a default blog, a default post, and some tags for the post. Those don't work because I haven't gotten that working with the SQL Alchemy thing. I want to just use strings. I don't want to use IDs. And it's kind of ornery about that. And then all I do is I check whether you're calling me with an INI to the right URL, and I then run the refresh of the database. That's it. It's really simple, but it gives me the point where I can start from scratch where I have a database. All I need to do is do a create DB in Postgres or MySQL or SQLite or whatever, and it will go, and whatever I'm using, it will flesh in all the data that I want to actually view my web page. So real quick, let's actually see the fruits of the labors you haven't seen. Okay, and I have to go. I keep wanting to do escape, and it doesn't work. I know, right? So I have this pyramid runner, and I'll show you it, even though it's going to be tiny. I'm sorry. I don't think I can go into presentation mode on this one. Come on. So can anybody see that? Is that large enough? I hope so. If not, well, we're sorry. So all it does is run pserve, which is another pyramid tool that will allow you to, through Waitress, which is a sort of minimalist WSGI server written in Python. Through Waitress, it will run your website. Do not run that in production. That is a dumb idea. But for dev, it's great. It's wonderful because you don't have to set up Apache and all that. So all it does is run pserve with this INI file. This is my development INI. And I do a -- reload. There is no reason that you should not have it reloading in development. And all that does is anytime I change any Python file in the entire project, it will restart the web server. You may be used to this from like Flask or Django. Everybody has this. But you know, it doesn't come on by default in any of those. So please use it, please. It will make your life a lot less painful. You won't have to restart a process every time. I add sources to the Python path because I don't have any, but it has that as checked by default. And all that's going to do is just run that, and it'll listen with the things in my development INI. All those variables like listen on the 0.0.0 host, that's good. If you're doing this in Windows, by the way, I don't recommend it because you have to know a little bit of finagling things, and they're not on. There are no tutorials on the web to teach you about Windows inner workings when you're doing development with stuff that's not Windows specific, like .NET. But Windows has this wonderful tendency to just say, you know, I don't actually want to listen on 0.0.0 because I don't actually have that address. I think that's a valid address. It's not, obviously, for anybody that knows IP spec stuff. But this is the website, and I had to go to 127.0.0.1, which is an IP address that I actually have. So you know, it will tell you in PyCharm or on the command line. This is literally the command line output. You can see why I like it. It will say just connect to 0.0.0. It is lying to you if you're on Windows. It is perfectly fine if you're on Linux, and I often am. Content here. So this is a bit that is just from the template raw, and then this is a bit that's sent in by Python, by Pyramid, by our Python code through Pyramid's workings. If you get into the bowels, you can actually have Pyramid do some of this stuff for you, but I don't know why you would, because then you would want to do something automatic like Django that does things for you. Pyramid is for when people want to do things themselves. They want control. This specifically, this template is in, you know, templates, shocker, and home. This is our block of content, and it goes into the base. This is my fancy HTML. I am a designer. You know it. This is our menu, and this is where the block of content goes. This is how you do an include in Jinja 2 if you so desire. You don't actually have to do this, but you do have to start from somewhere. You have to spit out some HTML to start whatever thing you're doing. Like in Angular or other JavaScript frameworks, you have to spit out at least an HTML page that includes the thing that is going in JavaScript that is going to actually populate your page. I do it for me because, again, I'm lazy, I'm old school, and I'm an adult. So that's really simple. if you have problems with that, there are resources on the web to tie into where your problem exactly is. You can go on IRC, there's mailing lists, there's forums, you know, the typical open source projects that kind of intimidate people. Or, you know, you can find me and I'll ignore you just as much, and that's fine. No, I will actually try to be helpful. I don't handhold, but I will definitely try to point you in the right direction of, hey, you're getting this error. Well, maybe you should look at this kind of a thing, and, you know, let you think about that and ponder it. So, any questions about the ramblings that I have done this evening? I feel like I've been very thorough in ways that are probably not helpful and more confusing than they're helpful, but I'm here to clarify if you need support. So Python is perfectly, well, okay. I'm going to answer this in two ways. Python 3 supports everything that Pyramid does. Python 3 and WSGI don't get along well completely because Unicode. This probably won't be a problem for most people in this room. But if you work with any other texts like Chinese, Korean, Arabic, you will run into problems with Python 3 and any WSGI whatsoever without doing a lot of reading and finagling. This is not necessarily a problem with Python 3 or Pyramid or Django or anything like that. It's a problem where WSGI treats everything as strings even though HTTP doesn't, even though HTTP does. And if that's confusing, that's because it is, because HTTP is a nightmare. We're basically trying to take a document retrieval protocol that's just, you know, give me this file, and we've turned it into some sort of app server thing, and that doesn't work well when we do things like localization. So it's fully Python 3 compatible, and we actually run it on Python 3.3 and 3.4 in my personal projects and in my work office. Not because we run that in production, but because we want to test it so it's prepared for production as we develop. The last I checked, CentOS 7 and Ubuntu Server 14 don't ship with Python 3 as a default, but again, I encourage everybody to be very aware that Python 3 is on the horizon, and you should probably be developing to it now. So, very good question. Thank you for asking. Did that answer it? Awesome.
So, at the very beginning, you made this big sale about all these features that Pyramid has, and then you said, I don't use any of them.
Yes, so Python provides the modules for all sorts of things, yes.
Right, so I mean, I guess in terms of Pyramid, what I was asking was more about, then you talked about how it was flexible. What's the purpose of having these in there if they're not going to use them? I mean, just because they give you something to start with?
So they provide some things like, keep turning that off, I'm sorry. So they provide some things like the authentication system that they have, which is a very enterprisey kind of authentication system. Anytime that you have an authentication system that talks about principles, not principles like principles of like valor, but principles as in principal, you should avoid that like the plague, because that is not for you unless you are an enterprise developer, and in that case, why are you using Python? Pyramid stuff does. Pyramid, if you read Pyramid's docs on their authentication system that they include de facto, it's a nightmare to use. So I don't use that one, for instance. But it provides that. It provides scaffolding for SQL Alchemy. I do use that. It provides two different routing mechanisms. One of them is just called URL routing, and one of them is called traversal. Traversal is like they decided that they really wanted to have this directory tree in your URL structure, and that works for a couple of the main core developers who are developing like a CMS thing for some of their clients. But it is incredibly confusing, and I don't recommend it until you actually need something more powerful than the URL routing by default. So you include that later. You include the traversal afterwards.
In other words, they have some options for you, like
Yeah.
some complexities that might be useful later on.
Exactly.
Or things that could be useful right away. Pretty much.
Yeah, and he was asking about XML, and I said I wouldn't talk about it, but now I'm going to lie again. They do have XML processors and whatnot that you can include. So, yeah, I don't use the debug toolbar, but if I didn't have a debugger that I enjoyed using, like in PyCharm, then I'd probably use the debug toolbar more. Anything else?
Is there any sort of relation creation
So, HTML5 storage is all done through JavaScript, not through like HTTP headers typically. There's ways you can sort of shoehorn some of the functionality through that, and you can set any header you want in the Python or in the Pyramid machinery. The request and response stuff is actually based on WebOb. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but in the web world of Python, you have stuff that's based off of WebOb, stuff that's based off of WorkZig, you have Django, and you have some plain WSGI minimalist frameworks like Bottle. So WebOb provides the request and response, and you can just set whatever headers you want. And you can break HTTP spec that way, so be careful with that much power. But typically any X header you want to just define yourself won't break anything. But it gives you that power to just say, well, you want to build a WebSocket thing? Well, you can. I've had conversations in the Pyramid channel on Freenode with people trying to implement WebSockets specifically through Pyramid. That is a bad idea. Every time we just try to talk about it, like, no. You don't want to keep that open in your process. No. You want to use something like Twisted or something. There's other things out there, but I will suggest Twisted because it's got the most traction on that front. So to answer your question, it gives you all of that functionality through either JavaScript that you've pushed to the server, the client, or through header manipulation. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Now is the time to get the answers to your questions. Mm-hmm. So let's talk. Let's go to a view, and I will show you what I mean. So in here, I have, oh yeah, okay, this is a good example. So view presentation mode. So in here we have two views, right? And the renderer you will see is a Jinja 2 template. This is shorthand because the renderer is actually the Jinja 2 engine, and it's taking that as its only argument. So the Jinja 2 engine is the thing that is called here. If you want a JSON serializer, there's one called, I think it's 2JSON or JSON. One of the two. But that's how you tell it to go to JSON. And like he was asking if you wanted to go to XML, there's another renderer to take basically a Python dictionary that you're returning and render it as something else. Very rarely, and I really suggest against this, rarely shall you return HTML from a view. You'll return data from a view to some sort of renderer. And that gives you the flexibility to say, I'm going to go in a Jinja 2 template, or I'm going to go in a Chameleon template because I hate myself, or I'm going to go to JSON, any number of renderers as well. Like we were on CJSON, and then we switched to UJSON because it fit our needs better. I don't recommend that as a blanket statement. I just say that because it will give you the flexibility to choose the implementation that fits your needs. So you'll pick a JSON renderer. It comes with one by default. It's, I think, based on simple JSON, and it just goes from there through the JSON renderer. And you add those renderers as plugin modules or as renderers. There's an add renderer, like the add request method that I showed. There's an add renderer method as well, where you can write your own if you want. Does that answer your question? Okay.
When you do that scaffold with what exactly is SQL?
So SQL Alchemy is a good question. So long ago, in the land of Orms, there was Django, and there was nothing. SQL Alchemy said, you know, I really hate Orms, but I really want to write my SQL in Python instead of SQL. And so it took PsychoPG2, which is an API built on DB API. I'm just giving you more acronyms and things to ask about, really. Python specifies a thing called the DB API, and that's how you're supposed to access every single database known to man in Python. And people provide renderers around the DB API for different engines. There's like 3 for Postgres. The one that everybody uses, because it's the only one that's actually sane, is PsychoPG2. SQL Alchemy is a way to kind of take a Pythonic way of rendering SQL that is agnostic to whatever DB is behind it. So you can use an SQLite database. Are you familiar with databases? Okay, so SQL Alchemy is for relational databases, like the old school databases that are, how can I say this without offending people? That are sane, and they're ACID compliant, and you know they provide those kind of flexibilities and safeties for consistent data. So when you store data permanently in some backend server like MySQL or Postgres or SQLite, that you're using the DB API through something. And SQL Alchemy is just saying, you know, all of these use SQL as a standard, and then they build on their own crap. So like you have a table that's like an Excel spreadsheet basically of columns and then rows of data, right? And you want to select all the rows of data that match this criteria, like they all start with A on their first name column or whatever. SQL is a way of describing the language, and it was invented in like the 60s, just kind of showing its age. But we haven't invented something better. But we don't want to write SQL because SQL is dumb is a good word, yeah. It was never meant to be smart, but people have built on all sorts of crazy like programming stuff on SQL. But SQL is a way of retrieving your data in a consistent way, so you can swap between compliant databases and still have the same data. SQL Alchemy is saying, you know, I want to do this in a Pythonic way. In this long, we have 1,500 line queries at MobileSense because we have a complicated data set, and anybody who has a non-trivial data set is right there with me on this. You have long queries, right? And you want to take chunks of that are kind of repetitive and break them out into their own function or whatever it is. SQL Alchemy is saying, yeah, let's do that. Let's make that in a Pythonic way. So I actually have some really simple SQL Alchemy that I can show in, I really wish it would not close that, blog views. So right in here, do presentation. So right in here we have on the request, I've added that database session called .db. And so this is the session, and I'm just going to run a query. And the Pythonic way is I have a posts table, and I have tied that through SQL Alchemy to this post class. I could write raw SQL here, but I don't want to because otherwise I would just use PsychoPG2. So the query is just going to query all of the things in the posts table, and then I'm going to give it this criteria, filter it by things that are listed, and that belong to the blog that I'm asking for, and you know, you're going to give me 100 pages of data, right? I want it not from the top, I want it from like 10 from the top, or whatever it is. So it gives you that description language to query your data, and SQL Alchemy is kind of the de facto standard for relational databases to query that data in a sane manner that's Pythonic, so that you don't pull your hair out at a young age. And that was a really expansive answer to your question. I'm sorry. SQL Alchemy, there's a really good tutorial on the SQL Alchemy page from the guy who wrote SQL Alchemy, if you ever want to learn SQL Alchemy. But SQL Alchemy requires that you learn SQL first, or at least be aware of the concepts. So don't go into it thinking like, oh yeah, I'll never need to learn SQL. No, the power of this is that it just takes SQL knowledge and translates it to Python knowledge. So I recommend it to anybody that likes databases. You will use a database at some point in your life, I promise you. You may not think you are, but you will. Everybody does in their programming career, unless they work in embedded. And even then, I mean, SQL Alchemy or SQLite is a thing. Does that answer your question a little too much? Okay.
It does, but not.
So. Yeah. It does parameterized inputs, and I don't know if that's familiar to you or not, but it will do that in the way, and it does it in the way that is engine specific to the backend that you're using, whether it be Postgres or MySQL or whatever. There's no MySQL real escape strings or anything like that. You just hand it things, and it will parse things. Okay.
Thanks, guys. Go to the platform.
You don't have to.